Perfect. Well, thanks everyone for coming. This is my latest talk, building APIs using Laravel, a simpler approach to scale. It's a talk I've not done yet, so bear with me if there's a few things that don't flow quite as smoothly. I've gone through it several times, but you never know until the night. So I shall get started. So who am I? I'm Steve McDougall. You can find me pretty much most places as just Steve King. I used to be Steve King, but when I got married, I took my wife's last name. I'm one of those people. So ignore the confusion if you're wondering who just Steve King is. I'm a PHP user group organizer. I've been running PHP South Wales for over 2 years now, and one of our attendees, Oliver Davies, is taking over from me recently. So I can focus on all the other millions of things that I do. I'm a conference organizer. I'm putting on a conference in November this year called BabbleTech, which it's high-level technical process conference. Ask me about it later if you're interested. I'm a huge PHP and Golang advocate. Obviously, I'm a bearded man and quite proud of that fact. And I'm a self-employed consultant now for around 13, 14 months. I've been building APIs for probably around 8 years. So this is a combination of what I've learned over the last 8 years of building APIs and what I've learned more recently adopting OpenAPI and that approach. So the first thing that I think of when people ask me about APIs is where do most people go wrong? And in Laravel, we've all hit that point of no return, haven't we? We've got hundreds of models in our app directory, or we've moved them to an app models directory, and all we've really done is shifted a heavy namespace from this end to that end. And all of our models have got more scopes than your average game of Call of Duty because you want to add all of these different ways that you can query your data. But what if there's a better way? So the best thing to think of when you're building an API is design the API you actually want before you're building an API you don't actually need. A lot of people will just wrap JSON interfaces around database tables and call it an API. Not always the best way to do it. So it's more than just a CRUD wrapper. OpenAPI it's been around a while. It used to be Swagger, but there's a lot more traction for it these days with people like Phil Sturgeon, Lorna Jane, Rob Allen, all trying to get more people to adopt it when they're building APIs. So it's easy to build these CRUD resources and just use JSON to interact with it with your Laravel API, then controlling it using your standard role-based permissions, or in Laravel using gates. And it's a lot harder to build an API that's going to not only provide better value to the people using it, but give that trimmed down view of what's actually needed within your API. So this image I stole. I did get permission. I asked Phil Sturgeon, who works at Stoplight Studio, who is always talked about OpenAPI and API design first. And the idea here is that you've got this idea for an API. That it could be a blog, it could be an e-commerce store, it could be anything. But what you need to come up with a strategy and research how your audience is going to work with that API. And once you've got some resemblance of a plan, you kind of go through this requirements gathering with stakeholders internally and externally. You sketch out how it should work and how people want to be interacting with it. Those people who may build open source packages are probably quite used to this part of the process where you know what you want to build. You design the API for your package, for your library that you want people to expose, and then you wrap the functionality around that. It's a similar approach, but for a web API. So once you've got an idea of what you'd like to achieve and you've sketched it and you've got all the requirements from all your different stakeholders, internal, external people, you start to create your API descriptions. Now, we saw a quick example of that here. So as you can see, it's an open API version 3, a little bit of information about what that API is, what servers it's available on, and then you get into the paths. This is very much similar to what Swagger was like, but it's a little bit better now. So I will carry on going through this because we'll get back to that in a little while. But once we've designed it and we've created those descriptions, we can use tools to start to mock this API. We can start to build some of the interfaces, whether that be mobile or web, that's going to work alongside this API and actually consume this API. And you can use those the mocks coming from your API description to really get a concrete understanding of, okay, I didn't think of this part of my API, or I could do this bit a little bit better. Maybe I need to provide extra options. We then go back into this kind of feedback loop of, is this good enough? Is this what we need to do? Is this a good initial release? Is there anything else we need to consider at this point? And if there is, we just go back through that cycle of creating more descriptions, fine-tuning our descriptions, testing the mocks, making sure it's all working as we expect. And then we go back to a prototype where we're actually writing Laravel code. And every time we iteratively go through this process of, right, we need to start adding more to our API, or want to open up these extra bits of features that we're getting coming through our release cycle, we go back to that same design process of create our descriptions, test against the mocks, get feedback, go through that loop until it's where it needs to be before you release. So this approach is called design first, API design first. And I'm not the only person talking about it, thank God, but it's a really powerful way to look at building APIs. So if you take your typical developer workflow in a Laravel environment, let's say you're building a to-do app, which most people tend to do at one point or other. You might want to start to add extra features, but you go through, you build out your main branch, you branch that off using Git flow to a develop branch. You start to create these feature branches. And within these feature branches, not only can they contain your Laravel code, but it can contain your API descriptions so that you've got rollback points, each feature between your API description, the implementation code you've been creating, and the mock that can be created from that description itself. And it bundles it into a very nice testable workflow. So for me, when I'm building an API, and once I know I need to build an API, before I get to the stage of, right, I'm going to write an API description, I need to domain model a little bit. I need to understand what my domain is and what's going to be going on. So what I typically do in Laravel, which is sometimes shuddered at in the Laravel community, is I take the fake domain-driven design approach within Laravel. So I don't put it in an app directory, in a models directory. I typically create a domain directory. And within that domain, that's where I keep my context. So for example, in this example here, I'm using a shared context. That's things like a user or a tag or a category or a note, anything that can be shared between other domains itself. And what I tend to do, I have a example here, a domain shared models directory where my models will live. So my user model as an example, which will have a user builder and a user collection, all separated into nice little bundles that are very specific points of what they do within that domain. So once we've factored our model from that basic Laravel, let's add in all of the methods to our model, let's add in all of our scopes, and let's start to really beef this business model up. I add a couple of methods which aren't as commonly used on the Eloquent models themselves. And that's a new Eloquent builder, which will return a new Eloquent builder based off of the model you're in. So you're basically pushing all of those scopes, all of those extra queries you're going to want to build on your domain models, and you're pushing that off to a separate class, trimming 20, 30, possibly more lines of code out from that model and pushing it to its dedicated class where you know, okay, so there's something slightly wrong with the way I'm querying about this, or I want to extend a query. You know you need to go over to the builder for that model, because that's what you typically do in Laravel. You, okay, so I want my user, I want to query, I want to enter the builder at that point and do a where clause, a where has, where between. All of those scopes that you might be building get pushed off to the new user builder in this example. And then we have a collection as well. So by default, Eloquent will return a standard collection from every model. It'll return a collection full of models that you have, and you get an amazing amount of helper functions on that collection. You've got each, you can filter, you can map over them, you can tap into them. I've lost count how many methods are on collections, but what this does is by creating a new collection on that model and by returning a new user collection, you can create extremely specific collection filters on your Eloquent models. So one that I typically use is an active. So let's say you get a list of 30 users back from your database. Now you could approach that with a scope and add a where clause where the active is true, or depending on your UI and the implementation that you actually need, you could just filter what's already there by using a collection method. So here's an example of our builder class. So in Laravel 7+, there was the email verified at aspect to your user model. So that's where you can enforce the verification of an email address for anybody who registers. It was relatively easy to do, but here's an example of where the Eloquent builders really come in handy. All we've got to do is say, return this where not null, email verified at. It's a nice quick function, doesn't have to be prefixed with scope, it doesn't need anything because it's already part of the builder at that stage. These can get a bit bigger. I'm always very careful about what I add into my specific model builders. If it gets to a point where a couple of models are sharing similar scopes, I will create a global scope, or I will create a trait and pull it in so that all of the models can share that. And again, that would sit within that shared domain within the application. And the reason for this is to stop massive directories full of files where a junior developer or anybody coming along who's not familiar, they've got to, if you've got to scroll on your mouse wheel or on your trackpad more than twice, you've probably got way too many classes in that directory and under that namespace. So what I like to do is really encapsulate small useful classes within the domains and then utilize that shared domain for any shared behavior between them. So once I've done some domain modeling, I know I've got to modify my routing a little bit. So this is what I had to update before the talk. So this is Laravel 8's root service provider. We're not all used to seeing this anymore. This came out a week ago, but the only thing that's really changed is we used to have a map function which did the mapping of the domains, and we used to just boot the parent. But this new version, we're doing it all in that boot method. So we're configuring our rate limiting. Excellent, that's what we want to be doing. And then we're mapping over our routes. So we say, okay, so the routes available, we want to wrap all of the routes web PHP within the web middleware, and then we want to prefix API around all of the routes that are registered in the routes API.php, but we also want to add API middleware. Now, there's nothing wrong with that at all if you are building an application which is both full stack and an API. Absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. I'm talking about, the approach I'm talking about is when you are simply building an API. You aren't adding inertia, livewire, blade. You're not adding all of these front-end components that you might need to create and render views. You are talking about a JSON API at this point. And the way I refactor this is typically I have a boot method. And within that boot method, we configure the rate limiting, and then we register the routes. So what we're saying is, okay, I want to prefix everything within routes API v1.php under v1 using the prefix API. And then again, when we're extending that API and when we need to start adding new or improved routes, we can add a new reference in there to the route prefix v2 using the same middleware or updated middleware if you need to. And then we have a separate file for managing those version 2 API routes. And again, for version 3 and so on. Obviously, by the time you get to version 2 and you're starting to look at version 3, you'll be dropping support for version 1. So this file never gets too big unless you're providing longer support than what you should have, or you're releasing new versions of your API quicker than you should be. So we talked about middleware here, where we're wrapping in an API middleware. That doesn't do a massive amount in Laravel. It does a few basic JSON wrapping and no sessions. It's a trimmed down version of the web middleware for APIs. So APIs and JSON API are, as you can imagine, made for each other. And the best way I've found to do this so far in Laravel is to use a middleware around routes where you want to be supporting JSON API. So JSON, it has been properly registered and it's got its own media type. You can get away with returning a simple application/JSON, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. If you just want to have a standard API and you don't want to worry about being fully, following every single specification available for APIs, just use application JSON. There's nothing wrong with it at all. I tend to build very specific APIs for my clients that I work with, and I pride myself on the standards of PSR2, Open API specifications, JSON API. I follow whatever standards that I can package, explain, and deliver to my client in the understanding that they know what they're getting at that point if they thoroughly read those documentations. So a simple implementation of this would be a nice bit of middleware which you wrap around all of your routes. And all it will do, it will pass off to the next request. This is an after middleware. And then when that request has been completed and you get that response back, we will create a vendor name at this point. So we'll create a sluggable version of your application's name. It could be to do, it could be PHP Cambridge, it could be anything. And if that is empty, we default back to API. Then what we do, we set the response header to be the content type of application VND dot whatever name was generated, or the default plus JSON, and return that response. That's the easiest way to do very basic JSON API response types. I quite like doing this, if I'm really honest. It feels very, you kind of feel cool when you're returning application VND, my app plus JSON. You feel like you're playing with the big boys a little bit with your APIs. You don't need to, but you can do if you like. And because it's a registered content type, you can do that. So here's an example. GitHub currently uses application vnd.github.v3 plus JSON. So what they're doing there is they're versioning their API through the content type as well. And that's through the accept header and the return type header. I typically don't tend to do that because it can get very messy when you're trying to figure out where to route these things. But to build this up, we go, okay, so what type is it? It's an application. So VND, which stands for vendor. Then we've got the subtype, which would be GitHub, and any suffixes you might need to do with it. And then JSON. So that's how that is built up. And getting more into the routing, I suppose. So routing in Laravel, there's so many different ways you can do this, and there's no right or wrong way to handle routing in Laravel. You can do a simple get, put, patch, delete, options, trace request on an endpoint and pass it through to a method on a controller, on an action, on a service class, whatever floats your boat with that one. Or you can use API resources where you define your resource and you point it to a specific controller, and Laravel will map the the index, create, store, update, and delete requests on that controller for you, and it just maps one-to-one. You can go further within this and pass an array of which options you actually want to route to, what methods you only want to be able to route to within this resource. And then obviously there's that invocable controller where you say, okay, I want to perform this type of request on this endpoint. I want it to go directly to this class, which will be invoked. So my typical approach is something a little bit like this. What I will do, I will define my resource, and in this case, I'm going for Star Wars characters. So I'm prefixing all of my routes within this group with characters, and we're saying, okay, within the name section, I want everything to be Star Wars.characters, whatever that might be. And I just realized I got a typo, which really upsets me because it's in Star Wars. But within that group, we've got a get request to the first // and we are going directly to the collection action, because at that point we want a collection back. So I'm very specific, and I like to declare exactly what I'm trying to get within my routing and within the naming of the actions or controllers that I am using. And that we'll have a name of collection, and it just goes directly to an action. And as you can see over here, we are going through to a version 1 for the Star Wars characters, and we're performing the collection action within that. So what we do, if we ever need to update this, we can have a version 2 for Star Wars characters, which will have a collection action. And then if you want to extend this even further and add different characters, you'd have V1 Family Guy characters. Then we go on to our post request, which has a create method. We pass through the ID, or we can use root model binding if we want to. There's no, it doesn't matter which way you use it. You can pass through a parameter, you can pass through root model binding, or you can use the new root model binding where you can say the resource name with a colon and the database column field you want to look up through that root model binding. As you can see, I keep it very simple. I've got get a collection of all of my Star Wars characters. I want to create a new Star Wars character. I want to get a specific Star Wars character. I want to update this specific Star Wars character, and I'd like to delete this specific Star Wars character. Jar Jar Binks springs to mind on that last one, perhaps. And so we've now routed everything. We've created our service provider. we've designed our API using open API specifications, using something like Stoplight Studio or one of the many others like Postman, any of those, or just directly creating YAML files if you've got the heart to do that to yourself. And now we need to handle this route. So handling a route, it can be easy, it can be hard when it comes to an API. You know, how do you provide all of the different options that might need to come through to this route without that single method becoming 30, 40, 50 lines long, without passing it off to 20 different classes or to this repository to map over to do this? It starts to get very messy very quickly if you want short, snappy APIs in Laravel. So here's an example. This example is using one of the Sparsity packages, which is a query builder. It's a fantastic package for building APIs. So what you do is you get a query builder for a class, and then you say, okay, so these are the filters I want to be able to allow through the routing. Here's the allowed includes for this resource. Here's how I'd like it to be able to be sorted. I want to make sure I pass through any additional scopes. So here's published. So this specific example is getting blog posts. I only ever want to return published blog posts from my API because I don't want to return draft ones to something that anybody can consume. And then I want to paginate that model set. So these filters, what they'll allow you to do is filter what columns you want to be able to be displaying. And then the includes will allow you to say, okay, so I want to question mark include equals author, comma, category will include both of those if you're going to follow JSON API specification. And then with sorting, you want to go and sort equals, let's take an example, ID, we'll sort it so it's smallest to largest on the IDs. And then if you do a minus ID, it will sort it the opposite direction. It's all just part of JSON API. And the bonus what I've got here is I've got a framework that is created and supported by a first party who isn't going anywhere. I've got a library which is created and supported by a digital agency which relies on the framework and are extremely active in supporting what they publish. So all I've got to do is a little bit of domain modeling, a bit of open API specifications, scratch my head, figure out this little part here, and I've got a relatively good API. Then use an inbuilt collection, a resource through Laravel. I want to pass it through a collection because it is more than one. If you want to pass through just a single item, you wouldn't paginate anyway, you do a get. But then you go new post resource and pass it through just that single post. And again, you can still include the filters, you can still include the includes, but you wouldn't really need the sorting when it's a single resource. And then return response HTTP OK. Now that's coming from the Symfony HTTP response package, I believe. I have built a trimmed down version of that, which is on Packagist, which is literally an integer map to what the status might be. But what I found is if I did just a simple 200 response on this and a junior dev came along to work on this API and they don't understand HTTP codes, they're going to wonder what that 200 is, and they might return something different if they update it. Let's say it's an action that's creating a response. You either want that to be a 201 or a 202. So either that this resource has been created, or we have accepted this request and we will create this in the background. By using the static constant here from the library, it means that there's no question about what should be returned here. You can say response HTTP accepted, and you understand that this request has been accepted at that point. So here's a simple and clean resource, what we just saw. So down here, we have our post resource, which return with a collection, and we're passing through a paginated list of posts. So here's a post resource. We have an ID, which maps to this ID. We have a title, we have the content, we have any created information from a timestamp, which comes as default by Laravel. Now, what I like to do, I like to wrap this in a created object. So you can have the string version and the human version. So what you can do is when you're mapping over this in JavaScript or any other language, for example, you can get the created human value for display and the created string for any attributes on HTML entities that you might need to do. Let's say you want to wrap this in a time element in HTML. Instead of having to do any conversion yourself on the front end, you can simply just access the two different returned values from the API. Then we've got a published, whether this has been published or not. Now, if we go back, you can see I am asking for only published. There might be reasons why you'd want published in there. There might be reasons why you don't. Let's say this resource is available for two different API endpoints. One is for public consumption and one is for editing and for an admin view. So we want to be able to see whether it's been published. And then with the relationships down here, we've got author and categories, which are both available includes. And what we're doing is saying, okay, so we've only got one author for a post. So we want a new author resource, but only when author is loaded or it has been requested and it's been loaded into the Eloquent model that's been passed through. And again, with categories, we want to load all the categories for this post, but only when we're asking for the categories. So those last two are very optional. They will not be included, or they'll just be null if you haven't requested that data. So this could get a little bit more advanced. So here we're looking at something maybe a little bit more JSON API standard. So we've got a type, which is posts. We've got the identifier, which is the UUID of the post. And then we just have a map of attributes, very similar to what we had before. Wow, the wife just turned the light on. We've got the same attributes that we had before, but within an attributes tag. And then we have relationships. And within there, we have those included relationships where available. And we've just got a links to self, which goes back to why I'm adding the name on my routes. We want to get the collection for the posts. And by using the route helper function, it will take the environment for the app URL and append the relevant route for the collection of posts. So it's a nice, easy way to add something that resembles a JSON API specification in your resource. So we've talked through how we can set Laravel up. We've talked about the different ways we can do routing, how we can clean up some of the route service provider just to use APIs. We've talked about how our controllers will work, or our actions, or whatever we want to use to handle the routing, because in the end, it just needs to be a class or a closure. And we've just gone through resources and how we're going to respond. So you're going to want people to authenticate. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into authentication options in Laravel because that's a whole talk on its own. But the main ones available for you are things like HTTP basic authentication. Now, a lot of people shy away from basic authentication when it comes to APIs. I don't see why. There's a lot of enterprise size APIs out there that still to this day use basic authentication. It depends on who you're giving access to your API and why you're giving access to that API. Then you've got things like user-based token access. So they send you a request with an email, username, and password. You get that API token and you pass it back, and it's just something stored in the database. Very, very simple. And then you can pass that through an authorization header, a query string parameter, whatever that might need to be. And then we go into things like JWT authentication, which is a little bit more standard in the API world at the moment when it comes to Laravel. So we want to give you my credentials. You're going to create, hash, and return a JWT, which can then be decrypted and understood at my end, or I can pass it you back and you can understand who I am. And then we've got the latest one, which is Laravel Sanctum, which is a trimmed down version of OAuth. So you've got API keys available, you've got cookie authentication available, you've got standard session-based authentication available. It's kind of a everything but the kitchen sink and OAuth approach to API authentication, or web authentication to that matter as well. I've been using this library, the Laravel Sanctum library, a lot in the last probably 3 weeks, and it's actually pretty good, depending on what you need it for. And then you've got Laravel Passport, which is, if anybody knows Laravel, they know Laravel Passport is this behemoth of a backbone for OAuth 1 and 2, OAuth 2. So it means you can do any of the potential OAuth flows within your application, whether you want people to be able to log into another application with your application, do simple password credentials and generate OAuth JWT and authenticate that way. A lot of the time people reach for Passport. And before Sanctum was around, it was almost the default to reach for in the API world when you're building Laravel APIs was, right, I'm going to use Passport because I know it will do anything I need. And I know in 2 years, I'll probably still need it. Now, the best advice I've got when it comes to authentication and APIs is use the authentication you need for the next year. Don't worry about what you might need in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, because you might be rebuilding part of this. You might be switching to microservices. You know, with the way the technology industry is moving, stop worrying about what's going to be an issue in 3 years and use what you need now. You need a user to be able to authenticate, and you need to be able to tell who they are. Whichever one suits your needs, go for that one. Don't overcomplicate what should be a simple process of authentication. As I said, so use the authentication that works for your needs, not the one you think you will need, because you can't tell where your company is going or where your API is going. You're going to have companies tend to pivot and switch and change all the time, depending on where they can get you know, the money in for the budgets, and then that API, it needs to be flexible and adapt with that. So don't go for something massive like OAuth thinking, oh, in 6 months, we might need someone to be able to connect to our API from a third party and log in and get their user credentials, or you might not. So don't worry about that right now and just fit what needs you right now. So coming back to models and traits. I love traits in PHP. They were a fantastic thing that got introduced, and I probably overuse them sometimes, but I'm going to tell you all about them anyway. So in Laravel, they're really handy. You know, they allow you to kind of create these reusable little bits of code that you can slap on a model and be done with it. But obviously use with caution, be responsible PHP developers. What I tend to use them for is that kind of shareable behavioral, shareable logic that I need between my models mainly. So this one, for example, is a has UUID trait. Now, when you're creating a model, you could generate a UUID quite easily. It's quite easy to do using the Ramsey UUID library, which I'm using here, or you can create a trait and tap into eloquent events. So this one, the has UUID trait, what this does is within Laravel, if you don't already know, is if you have a trait which has boot and trait name at the end of it, it will be included within the boot up of that model whenever it's being used. So for example here, when this model is being created, I want to take the model, add a UID attribute using the Ramsey UID library, and that's all I need it to do. And then if you want to route through to UUID specifically using root model binding, you can add the public get root key name and just return UUID as a string. So just string UUID, return it, and it just works. So it allows you to encapsulate that behavior and logic really nicely and easily within traits, because chances are you're using an API. If it's a big API, you're probably going to want to look at UUIDs. If you want to hide some of your auto-incrementing IDs within your database, you will use a UUID. Like if you're like me, I've probably, in my latest project, I've probably got about 70 to 80 database models. About 2/3, maybe a little bit more, have UUIDs. Because they're publicly accessible. They are resources that I want people to be able to access. I want them to use the UUID. And what that taps into is, the next part is observing behaviors in our API. So model observers within Laravel. Some people use them, some people don't. They're kind of a hidden feature, which is really, really nice. But only when used right. You know, Laravel, it allows you to create classes for this, create classes for that, that do all of this different behavior. And when you first start out in Laravel, it's so tempting to go, right, I'm going to artisan make this, I'm going to artisan make that, then I'm going to artisan make this other thing over here. And then you've realized you've created 2 or 3 of the same sorts of functionality to do the same job. So if you're going to use things like model observers or mailables or notifications or events and listeners within Laravel, make sure you think which ones you're creating and why. So a model observer. So here we go. Previous example, I was using a trait, which is pretty simple way to do it, right? You know, you want to say, right, on this model, when it's being created, add this UUID. You can actually also do this with a model observer. You can, in your app service provider, you can say post observer. And then within there, it's got its own specific function, which says, while this model is being created, add the UUID, and that is it. So it's 2 different ways that you can do it. If you're going to have a lot of models that are going to use similar behavior, use a trait. If you've got the odd thing, like my example at the bottom here is when an author creates a new post, he wants to automatically publish this post onto social media channels. Relatively typical behavior for maybe a large media publishing application that got editorial workflow going through it. Now you could use a trait, but not many models within that application would actually need to share that behavior. So in that case, an observer would work really, really well for this. So this, I'll take you through the simple approach to the maybe I've over-engineered this approach. So a simple approach for publishing a post and then publishing that out onto your social media channels would be, you can create a post created event. We then create a listener for each social media channel you want to publish to. And then on each listener, we can post through to the API for that social media channel. Job's done. Nice and simple. And in a small scale application, fine. Absolutely nothing wrong with doing it this way. If you're maybe, you know, publishing once a day, twice a day, no more than 10 times a day, this is probably fine. And it won't cause too many issues. But from a development perspective, this could be improved. From a workflow perspective, it works fine. So let's take a slightly better approach to this. So we'll take the model observer and we'll create an event, and we'll use the created event off of the model, and we'll dispatch a post to the social media using a job. So we have our model observer, which is listening to this model created event, and that will trigger a dispatchable job into a background process, which will then come back when that's coming back to being handled. It will take the social media APIs you need to post to, and it will just post. Nice and simple. It's not doing much more than the example before, but it's using better parts of Laravel in a smart way. So we can use some background processors. So this event happening is all very synchronous. But if we push it to a background job, because we're publishing to 3 APIs, which might have a rate limiting, which could have a cooldown period, which could be being overloaded, let's push it to a background process and add some retry loops within there. Even if it's an API, the purpose of an API is to do a job and return back to the user as quickly as possible. So again, it's a step forward, but is it the best way to step forward? So a more advanced approach would be that you allow your user or the author to select multiple channels, whichever channels they want to post to. And then the model observer will dispatch a very specific background job for each social media channel they want to post to. And then that job is in charge of, like, post to the API, we've hit the rate limit, we'll retry again in 10 seconds, post to the API, it failed, log it as a failed job. It allows you to kind of granularly break these things down a little bit more by using core behavior. So not all systems need this size or this approach, because it's more work to create this. But if we take a step back and think about how we are approaching building this part of the functionality within our API, all that publisher cares about is clicking that button of publish, and they're expecting that to be available for their readers and to be published out to whatever other channels they might need to. And it's how we can approach that problem, even as an API or as a full stack Laravel application, is how can we approach this in an extendable way so we can refactor should we need to. So as promised, an overkill approach, something completely over-engineered for the use case that is needed, would be using event sourcing and CQRS. Now, if you've got a CQRS or event sourced application already, then it's probably not overkill. It probably fits into your development workflow already, and it's easy enough to add these extra little features on top of it. Within Laravel, most people aren't using CQRS because it's a pain to get going. Since Laravel 5 dropped the command bus, and you've got to start to pull in all of these extra packages and kind of jigsaw it together and get it to work within Laravel, it's a bit of a pain. But if you need to do it, it is worth the time because it is a fantastic pattern, and it will create this trail of events of this post being changed, the application state, a long time. And when we've published to the API, we can change the state of that. And it gives you a lot of analytical information of how we got to this point. But perhaps overkill for publishing a blog post and publishing it onto social media channels. So an example job would be publish to Twitter. Now, within our constructor, we want to take the post and we want to take the author. That is serialized in the database as it's stored, or it's serialized on the payload, which is passed to Amazon SQS, or it's serialized into Redis. And then when it's called, it hits the handle function. And this acts, so the handle function on a job, think of it like an application constructor. Anything you pass into here will get resolved outside of your DI container. So it will inject the Twitter service, it'll inject the tweet builder. You don't have to do any work around that. It'll be injected from the container, allowing you to get the serialized information from the constructor. So we'll try to post to Twitter using our Twitter builder. Away we go. If we have an issue, we can log the error, we can die, we can throw an exception as it's a job. And you might, if this is a business critical background job, you want to throw an exception here, because then Laravel will know that this job failed and it needs to retry this. If you don't mind it not being retried, log it, mail it, notification, whatever you need to do. The key thing here is if you need it retrying because it's business critical, throw an exception and it will be retried again later, allowing you to then have a look at why that didn't work. So I can't talk about building an API in PHP using Laravel without a hat tip to test-driven development. So it's got a very good set of testing tools within it. It uses PHP unit under the hood. You can pull in bhat, you can pull in whichever library you want to use, but by default it's got PHP unit. And as you're building APIs, anything from 7.* onwards has got some really good helpers for testing HTTP requests, which you can use against third-party APIs, your own APIs if you really want to. And if you want testing your Laravel applications already, start it. You know, start writing your test. You'll thank me in the long run. This is actually a lot easier than you think, and it's quite a nice process to go through. You know, you write your API description, you write your test of how it's meant to work based on the description, you write the implementation, you make sure your tests are green, your output for your API matches the output that is expected from the mock or from your description. That is feature complete, collapse, push up to develop branch, next feature. So very simple test. I always use database migrations within my tests, or sometimes I use database transactions. So that's a nice little trait within Laravel, which will, if you're using, you can use an in-memory SQL-like database store for your tests. And what this will do, on each test, it will just rerun all your migrations and just do those very specific, any data added will be about that small specific part. You don't have to worry about extra data along the sides. What I sometimes do, I use the database transactions, which what it will do, it will run the transaction, see if it's going to run and see if it's going to be stored. As long as that's going to be stored, it just won't finalize that transaction against MySQL or whatever database driver you're using. So the easiest way to test API endpoints is say this get my API endpoint, get my response, and assert status. Is this what I'm expecting? You can then go down and break through things like asserting JSON has keys. You can assert body contains, assert header is there. You can start to really drill down what is available. And that's it. That is my talk on building scalable APIs in Laravel. It's taking you through an approach. It's more about workflow than it is code. So we've talked about how can we clean up our models? How can we get cleaner routing for when we're building an API? How are we going to declare our routes and which one's going to work best for us and the team that we're working with? So content middleware, how we're going to follow JSON API, how are we going to action the requests coming into our API? What are we going to do with them? How are we going to handle that? Keeping our responses from our API consistent by using API resources, how useful traits can be, how to observe models and add additional behavior on key actions and events within our API, how we can use dispatchable jobs to maybe background process less important synchronous actions that we might want to run. And then obviously testing. Always test your APIs, whether that's front end, back end, why you're writing it, why you're describing it. Test every process, because if anything goes wrong, you've got that chain of, this is my workflow. I write my description, I write my test based on that description, I write my implementation, everything's green, all the shit, it's mimicking that description with what the stakeholders have agreed to and have authorized. Within a single suite of tests, we are good, we can push that live. So APIs don't have to be hard, but they've definitely got to be stateless. Always remember that HTTP REST APIs are stateless. They should not remember anything from the last request. And thanks for listening. I actually managed to waffle on for quite a while there, so thank you very much. And if anyone's got any questions, I'll stop sharing my screen and answer in the Q&A. Ooh, 2 questions. So David Carr has 2 questions. Ooh, greedy man. So would I recommend UUID over hash ID? Yes. Personally, I'd recommend UUID because it's more of an industry standard. Now, hash IDs are nice, and hash IDs definitely have their use cases, but I wouldn't use it as an API when a lot of the industry is already using UUID or a version of UUID. Is that okay? Does that make sense? Is he still here? Yep, cool. That was good. Right, can I do, oh, I can dismiss. Cool, excellent. Right, I will drop a link to that. I will post a link to my HTTP package on Twitter, and I'll type PHP Cambridge later on after I finish the talk, and any additional questions. Remind me to do that, Simon or Joe or someone, just in case. So can't submit to Q&A. Is it better to include the version number for your API in the URL over? So I've actually had a very long discussion about this with several people, and there's no specific way to do it. I personally like doing it within the URL because it means that I can be very specific in how my application is built and routed, and I can drop support when I need to drop support. What I can do in my V1 API, let's say I get a route coming in to get all of the all to-dos, for example, very basic example, but all of my route, I got a request coming in to get all of my to-dos to V1. I can do a 302 redirect to V2 and force the behavior, and then I can just monitor use case on which routes are actually being called to know when to drop routes. You can do the header approach, you can do content type approach, you can various approaches. I found doing it through URL routing is the best one that I've found, because then I can also match that to vendor namespacing within my Laravel application as well. Ruth, one thing I was concerned about when talking about the boot trait pattern is that it's invisible code, which makes debugging. Yes and no. It's a trait, and it is called within a method on the model itself. So part of the eloquent boot method is to take all traits which have a method with boot trait name and then execute them throughout the processing thread. So it might not be perfect, but would you rather have something that you've tested with using TDD and you can prove for a fact that it works every single time no matter what you throw at it and use a trait? or would you rather maybe implement the same method on every single model, or use an observer for every single model, which is again increasing that. It's no, I wouldn't use traits for everything. Sorry, I just saw your next question come up. I wouldn't use traits for everything, definitely not, because it feels like an anti-pattern. If a model's got more than 5 traits, then maybe you need to think about refactoring it into something else. But like with most things in development, you've kind of got to pick the lesser of two evils, and unless you're going to spend, 3 weeks debating about this implementation, that implementation, or that approach, you've got to kind of get to that point of, am I going to worry about what I might need to debug, or am I going to test every use case I can, have an acceptable failure amount, and push forward? If that answers your question, Ruth, at all? Yeah, cool. Again, if you do have more questions, feel free to reach out on Twitter. I'll answer the last one from Simon. Do you have any tips on logging requests to APIs to aid debugging? No. There's so many different ways that you can do it. You can use something like New Relic, or you can add middleware to log it, or you can just use standard application logging within Laravel. They've all got their benefits, and I suppose it depends on the API you're building and how much traffic you're expecting. Ideally, what I would do with an API is I'd push that to a daemon worker or a background process, something that isn't specific to my API, but is more specific to my infrastructure or server itself, meaning that my API isn't going to slow down or have long hanging processes going on because I'm busy trying to log every request coming through, because I suddenly got 10,000, 20,000 requests to my API instantaneously. Things like Kubernetes or any other thing like Google Cloud Engine, they've all got some sort of monitoring that you can do. I always lean on how can I do this in an infrastructure or server level at the very least. Okay, well, thank you.